On a Tuesday morning in late September 1963, the sun broke across Lenox Avenue with that particular slant of light that turned the brownstone windows into mirrors of copper and gold. The temperature had not yet climbed above 60 degrees. Women walked with sweaters draped over their shoulders, and men kept their suit jackets buttoned. The sidewalks carried the usual traffic of early risers, sanitation workers finishing their routes, shop owners cranking open metal gates, mothers walking children to PS 184 before heading to their own jobs in Midtown Manhattan. The air smelled of coffee from the corner diner and exhaust from the crosstown buses that rumbled past every 7 minutes. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson stood outside the Lido Lounge on the corner of 147th Street, dressed in a dark gray suit with a white shirt buttoned to the collar, but no tie. His shoes were polished Oxfords, worn enough to show they were practical rather than decorative. He was 58 years old, his face deeply lined, his hair gray and cropped close. He carried himself with the posture of a man accustomed to being watched, shoulders back, hands often clasped behind him. People in Harlem knew him by sight, and many knew him by reputation. Some crossed the street when they saw him. Others nodded with a deference that required no words. Johnson had been back in Harlem for less than a year after serving a sentence at Alcatraz for conspiracy charges related to narcotics operations. His time inside had not diminished his influence. If anything, it had clarified it. During his absence, control over the neighborhood's numbers rackets and protection operations had fragmented among younger operators who lacked both his discipline and his understanding of how power functioned beyond the immediate block. His return had been quiet but unmistakable. He did not announce himself. He simply resumed patterns. Morning walks through the neighborhood, afternoon meetings in the back rooms of certain establishments, evening dinners at Red Rooster or Wells's restaurant, where he sat with community members ranging from ministers to businessmen to the men who ran the street-level operations. On this particular morning, he had stopped outside the Lido because the owner, a man named Cecil, had mentioned needing advice about a vendor dispute. Johnson did not charge for such consultations. He understood that being available for these small problems maintained the infrastructure of respect and obligation that allowed larger operations to function smoothly. While he stood waiting, an elderly woman approached from the direction of the Baptist church, 2 blocks east. She wore a dark blue dress that had been mended at the hem, a worn cloth coat despite the mild weather, and shoes that showed cracks along the leather. Her hair was covered with a scarf tied beneath her chin. She carried a brown paper bag in one hand. She walked slowly, not from ceremony, but from the physical necessity of age and poorly treated arthritis. Johnson recognized her as Mrs. Henrietta Davis, a woman who had lived on 145th Street for more than 30 years. Her husband had died in 1959 from complications of diabetes. She had raised 4 children, 3 of whom had moved to other cities for work. The 4th, a son named Thomas, had been killed in 1961 during an altercation outside a bar on 8th Avenue. Johnson had attended the funeral. Mrs. Davis stopped in front of him, set down her bag, and looked at him directly. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts, but still focused. She did not greet him with the deference most people employed. She simply said she needed $5 to pay for her grandson's school supplies. The boy was in 6th grade. His teacher had sent home a list of required materials, notebooks, pencils, a compass for geometry, a dictionary. The total cost was $6.30. Mrs. Davis had saved $1.30. She had asked her church for help, but their benevolence fund was depleted until the next month. She had asked her landlord for an advance against her cleaning work in the building, but he had refused. She was asking Johnson because she had heard he sometimes helped people in the neighborhood with immediate needs. Johnson listened without interrupting. When she finished, he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a leather billfold. He opened it and looked inside. He carried cash in denominations that ranged from singles to hundreds, organized by value. He paused with his hand inside the billfold, then he closed it, returned it to his pocket, and told Mrs. Davis he could not help her. She did not argue. She did not ask why. She simply nodded, picked up her bag, and began walking back in the direction she had come. Johnson watched her move down the sidewalk, her gait slower than when she had approached. He remained standing in the same position for several minutes after she disappeared from view. Cecil emerged from the Lido and asked if he was still available to discuss the vendor issue. Johnson told him to handle it himself and began walking east on 147th Street. He walked for 6 blocks without stopping, past the barber shops and record stores, past the storefront churches and the vacant lots where children played stickball during warmer afternoons. He did not acknowledge the greetings called out to him. When he reached his apartment building on Edgecombe Avenue, he climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and entered his residence. The apartment was modestly furnished: a sofa, 2 chairs, a radio, a dining table with 4 seats. The walls held no decorations except a framed photograph of his wife, Mamie, and a calendar from a local insurance company. He sat in one of the chairs and remained there for the better part of an hour. What occupied his mind was not Mrs. Davis specifically, though her situation had triggered the consideration. What occupied him was the structural problem her request had revealed. She was not unique. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of elderly residents in Harlem living in similar conditions. They had worked for decades in jobs that paid subsistence wages: domestic workers, janitors, garment factory laborers, kitchen staff. They had raised children under conditions of systematic economic exclusion. They had survived the Depression, the war years, the post-war inflation. Now, in what should have been their later years of relative stability, they found themselves trapped in a cycle where even small expenses became insurmountable obstacles. The mechanism of this trap was precise. Social Security payments, when available, averaged around $70 per month for individuals who had worked in the types of employment common among black workers in Harlem. Rent for even the most modest apartments in the neighborhood ranged from $40 to $60 per month. Utilities, food, and medical expenses consumed the remainder and often more. There was no margin for unexpected costs: a grandchild's school supplies, a winter coat, medicine not covered by the limited public health services. These needs became crises because there was no legitimate financial infrastructure designed to address them. The existing institutions that might have provided such infrastructure were either absent, hostile, or inadequate. Banks in Harlem were few, and those that existed rarely extended credit to elderly black residents, particularly women. The terms when credit was available were extractive, interest rates that compounded debt rather than relieving it. Loan sharks operated in this vacuum, offering immediate cash at rates that could exceed 100% annually, enforced through methods that ranged from harassment to physical intimidation. The city's welfare system required navigating bureaucracies designed, whether intentionally or through indifference, to discourage access. Applications required documentation many elderly residents did not possess. Wait times stretched for months. Denials were common, and appeals processes were opaque. Churches provided what assistance they could, but their resources came from congregations facing the same economic constraints. Benevolence funds were small and quickly exhausted. Mutual aid societies, which had been more robust in earlier decades, had weakened as younger generations moved away, or as the economic pressures of the 1950s and early 1960s strained their membership bases. Family networks, traditionally a primary source of support, were disrupted by the Great Migration's ongoing effects, by urban renewal projects that displaced residents, by the economic necessity that sent adult children to other cities in search of stable employment. Johnson understood these dynamics not from academic study, but from lived observation over decades of operating within and around Harlem's informal economies. His own enterprises existed in part because legitimate economic structures excluded the community they ostensibly served. The numbers racket, which formed a significant portion of his operations, functioned as an alternative banking system. People placed small bets, nickels, dimes, quarters, on three-digit numbers derived from published financial figures. The odds of winning were long, but the possibility existed, and the daily ritual of participation provided both hope and a sense of agency in an environment that offered little of either. When someone won, the payout could cover a month's rent or a medical bill or the cost of a family emergency. The operation also employed hundreds of runners, collectors, and managers, providing income in a neighborhood where legitimate employment opportunities were restricted by both formal discrimination and informal practice. But Johnson recognized that this system, while serving certain functions, also perpetuated vulnerability. It extracted money from a community that could not afford the extraction. It operated outside legal protections, which meant disputes were settled through methods that sometimes involved violence. It attracted law enforcement attention that resulted in arrests, convictions, and the removal of community members to prisons, further destabilizing families and neighborhoods. And it did nothing to address the underlying structural problems that made such a system necessary in the first place. Mrs. Davis's request for $5 had crystallized this understanding. He had refused her not because he lacked the money or because he was indifferent to her situation. He had refused her because giving her $5 would have solved her immediate problem while doing nothing to address the system that had created the problem. It would have been charity, and charity, he understood, was a mechanism by which power structures maintained themselves. It provided temporary relief while preserving the conditions that made relief necessary. It positioned the giver as benevolent and the receiver as dependent. It prevented the organizing that might actually challenge the structures of exclusion. What was required was not individual assistance, but institutional intervention. And institutions, particularly those operating in and around Harlem, were controlled by individuals and organizations that had little incentive to create systems that genuinely served the community. Landlords profited from high rents and poor maintenance. Merchants charged inflated prices because residents had limited mobility and few alternative shopping options. Employers paid below-market wages because the labor pool was captive, restricted from other opportunities by discrimination. Politicians responded to constituencies that did not include Harlem's poorest residents, or when they did include them, treated them as sources of votes to be managed rather than citizens to be served. Johnson spent the remainder of that day and the next several days considering which institution might be most effectively pressured to change its behavior in ways that would materially benefit people like Mrs. Davis. He consulted with several individuals whose judgment he trusted. One was Mamie, his wife, who had grown up in Harlem and maintained relationships across the community's social strata. Another was Reverend Malcolm Crawford, who led a congregation on 140th Street and who had been active in civil rights organizing during the late 1950s. A third was Nat Pettigrew, a businessman who owned a small chain of grocery stores and who understood both the economics of the neighborhood and the networks of wholesale suppliers and distributors that serviced it. These consultations occurred in private settings. Johnson's apartment, the church office after evening services, the back room of one of Pettigrew's stores. The conversations were structured around questions rather than pronouncements. What institutions had the most direct daily impact on elderly residents' lives? Which of those institutions had the most vulnerable points of leverage? What forms of pressure could be applied that would not result in retaliation against the most vulnerable community members? What allies existed who might support such pressure, and what would motivate their support? The institution that emerged from these discussions as the most appropriate target was the Harlem Merchants Association, a coalition of store owners that had formed in the 1950s to coordinate on issues ranging from security to supply purchasing to political advocacy. The association included approximately 60 businesses, grocery stores, pharmacies, clothing retailers, furniture stores, and hardware suppliers. Nearly all were owned by individuals who did not live in Harlem. Most were Jewish or Italian merchants who had established operations in the neighborhood during earlier decades and who continued to operate there because the customer base was stable and competition from chain stores was limited due to those chains' reluctance to invest in predominantly black neighborhoods. The relationship between these merchants and the community was complex. They provided essential services and employed local residents, though often at lower wages than comparable positions in other parts of the city. They extended informal credit to customers they knew, allowing families to purchase food or clothing when cash was tight, to be repaid when circumstances improved. But they also charged prices that were higher than those in stores serving white neighborhoods, justified by claims of higher insurance costs, greater theft, and increased security expenses. They resisted pressure to hire more black employees in management or ownership track positions. And they had recently united in opposition to a community proposal for a food cooperative that would have provided lower prices through collective purchasing and volunteer labor. Johnson's strategy began with documentation. He tasked a group of young men who worked in his organization with a specific assignment: Visit every store in the Harlem Merchants Association and record prices for a standardized list of items. The list included staples: bread, milk, eggs, rice, beans, cooking oil, flour, sugar, coffee. It also included household necessities: soap, toothpaste, toilet paper, light bulbs. The young men were instructed to be polite, to make the visits appear routine, and to record the information without drawing attention to the purpose. Simultaneously, a second group was sent to stores in predominantly white neighborhoods: the Upper East Side, Greenwich Village, parts of the Bronx near Fordham Road. They recorded prices for the same items at supermarkets and local grocers in those areas. The assignment took a week. When the data was compiled, the pattern was clear and quantifiable. On average, identical items in Harlem cost between 15% and 30% more than in the comparison neighborhoods. A loaf of white bread that cost 19 cents on the Upper East Side cost 23 cents on Lenox Avenue. A gallon of milk priced at 98 cents in the Village cost $1.15 in Harlem. The differences compounded across a weekly shopping trip, and over a month, a family of 4 could expect to pay between $8 and $12 more for the same goods. Johnson had this data typed into a formal report, complete with tables showing item-by-item comparisons. He had copies made at a print shop on 125th Street. Then he scheduled a meeting with Martin Greenbaum, the president of the Harlem Merchants Association. Greenbaum operated a pharmacy on 8th Avenue that his father had opened in 1938. He was 42 years old, a graduate of Brooklyn College, married with 3 children who attended private schools in Westchester County, where the family lived. He was not personally hostile to the community. He contributed to local charities, sponsored a little league team, and prided himself on remembering customers' names. But he also understood his business primarily through the lens of profit margins, overhead costs, and risk management. Harlem, in his calculation, was a higher risk environment that justified higher prices as compensation. The meeting took place in Greenbaum's office above the pharmacy on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October. Johnson arrived alone, carrying a briefcase that contained the price comparison report and several other documents. Greenbaum had agreed to the meeting with some reluctance, uncertain of its purpose, but aware that refusing Johnson was imprudent given his influence. They sat across from each other at a small desk cluttered with invoices and pharmaceutical catalogs. Johnson presented the price comparison report without preamble. He walked Greenbaum through the methodology, the data, and the conclusions. He noted that the price differentials could not be explained by transportation costs, as many of the stores used the same wholesale distributors. He noted that theft rates, while higher in some Harlem stores, did not account for the magnitude of the price differences, particularly for items kept behind counters or in locked cases. He noted that insurance premiums, while marginally higher, had been stable for several years and did not justify the consistent markups. Greenbaum's initial response was defensive. He cited the challenges of operating in the neighborhood: broken windows, shoplifting, slower inventory turnover for certain items, difficulty attracting qualified staff. Johnson listened without interruption. When Greenbaum finished, Johnson acknowledged that these were legitimate business concerns. Then he shifted the conversation. He explained that he was not interested in debating the justifications for current pricing. He was interested in whether the Harlem Merchants Association would voluntarily reduce prices to match those in comparable stores outside the neighborhood. He proposed a reduction of 20% across staple goods and household necessities to be implemented within 30 days. In exchange, he would ensure that theft in association member stores decreased significantly. He would also encourage community members to preferentially shop at association stores rather than at the few chain stores that had begun exploring Harlem locations. Greenbaum asked how Johnson intended to reduce theft. Johnson explained that theft was largely committed by young people who lacked alternative income sources. He would create those alternatives through expanded employment in his own operations and through pressure on other neighborhood employers to hire locally. He would also make clear through his network that theft from association stores would result in consequences more severe than legal prosecution. Greenbaum asked what would happen if the association declined the proposal. Johnson said that he would then pursue a different strategy. He would work with community organizers to establish a boycott of association stores. He would help fund the creation of alternative purchasing cooperatives. He would ensure that information about price differentials reached every household in Harlem through flyers, church announcements, and community meetings. He would invite journalists from the Amsterdam News and other publications to investigate and publicize the pricing practices. The association would face not only reduced revenue, but public scrutiny that would complicate their political relationships with city officials who were increasingly sensitive to civil rights concerns. Greenbaum said he would need to consult with other association members. Johnson said he expected a response within 1 week. They shook hands, and Johnson left. Over the next 6 days, Johnson met with multiple constituencies to prepare for various outcomes. He spoke with ministers at 5 of Harlem's largest churches, explaining the proposal and asking whether they would support a boycott if one became necessary. All 5 agreed, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, recognizing that their congregations would benefit from either lower prices or the empowerment that came from collective action. He spoke with leaders of the local NAACP chapter and with organizers from the Harlem Tenants Council, both groups that had experience mobilizing residents around economic justice issues. He spoke with Pettigrew and other black business owners, explaining that if a boycott occurred, there would be opportunities to expand their customer base and that he would help facilitate access to wholesale suppliers that had previously been difficult to work with. He also took steps to ensure that if enforcement became necessary, it would be surgical rather than chaotic. He met with the younger men who ran street-level operations in different parts of Harlem and explained that if a boycott was called, their role would be to monitor compliance, to document which stores were being avoided and which community members might be breaking the boycott, and to report this information rather than to take independent action. He emphasized that violence would undermine the strategy and that anyone who engaged in it would be removed from operations entirely. Greenbaum called on the 6th day. He said the association had met and discussed the proposal. There was significant resistance. Many members felt they were being unfairly targeted, that their prices reflected legitimate business costs, and that yielding to pressure from Johnson would set a dangerous precedent. However, There was also recognition that a sustained boycott could be financially devastating, and that the political climate was shifting in ways that made public confrontations around racial economic justice increasingly risky for white business owners. The association's counteroffer was a 10% reduction on a limited list of items, to be reviewed after 6 months. Johnson rejected this immediately. He said the reduction needed to be 20%, needed to cover all staples and household necessities, and needed to be permanent. He said if the association was unwilling to agree to these terms, the boycott would begin the following Monday. Greenbaum asked for another week. Johnson gave him 3 days. During those 3 days, Johnson made the first public moves. Flyers appeared throughout Harlem, posted on telephone poles, slipped under doors, distributed outside subway stations. The flyers listed the price comparisons in simple tables. They explained that Harlem residents were paying significantly more for the same goods available elsewhere in the city. They announced that a community meeting would be held on Sunday afternoon at the Abyssinian Baptist Church to discuss the issue and potential responses. The flyers did not mention the Harlem Merchants Association by name, but the implications were clear. The meeting at Abyssinian drew more than 300 people. Johnson did not speak publicly. Instead, Reverend Crawford and several other community leaders presented the information, explained the economics, and asked residents what they wanted to do. The sentiment was overwhelmingly in favor of action. People stood and shared their own experiences of struggling to afford basic necessities, of watching their limited incomes consumed by expenses that seemed arbitrarily high, of feeling powerless in their interactions with merchants who treated them as captive customers rather than valued patrons. By the time Greenbaum called again, 2 days after the meeting, the momentum had shifted decisively. He said the association would agree to a 15% reduction on staples and household necessities, implemented within 30 days, with a commitment to review and potentially expand the list of covered items after 90 days. He said this was the absolute maximum the membership would accept. Johnson agreed, but with conditions. The reduction would be monitored by a community committee that would include representatives from the churches, the NAACP, and local tenant organizations. The committee would have access to wholesale invoices to verify that the reductions were genuine and not offset by reduced quality or quantity. Any association member found to be violating the agreement would be publicly identified and subject to selective boycott, and the association would commit to hiring at least 30 additional Harlem residents in entry-level and supervisory positions within the next 6 months, with hiring decisions subject to review by the same community committee. Greenbaum initially resisted the monitoring provisions, arguing they were intrusive and unprecedented. Johnson said they were non-negotiable. The association had broken community trust through years of extractive pricing. Rebuilding that trust required transparency. After consulting again with association members, Greenbaum agreed. The price reductions took effect on November 15, 1963. They were implemented unevenly at first, with some stores complying fully and others attempting minimal adjustments. The Community Monitoring Committee, which included Mrs. Henrietta Davis among its members, visited stores regularly, documented discrepancies, and reported them at weekly meetings that Johnson attended. When violations were identified, Johnson would send someone to speak privately with the store owner. In most cases, this was sufficient. In 2 cases, selective boycotts were organized against specific stores, maintained until full compliance was achieved. The economic impact on Harlem households was measurable. A family spending $50 per month on groceries and household necessities saved approximately $7 to $8 under the new pricing structure. Over a year, this amounted to savings of $85 to $95, more than a month's rent for many families. For elderly residents on fixed incomes, the relief was even more significant, creating margin where none had existed before. The employment provisions took longer to materialize, but eventually resulted in 43 new positions across association member stores, including 8 supervisory roles. The hiring process was contentious, with some merchants resisting and others making good faith efforts to identify and train qualified candidates. The community committee reviewed applications and conducted interviews, ensuring that placements were based on capability rather than favoritism. Johnson's role in maintaining compliance was largely invisible to the broader public. He did not give interviews or make speeches. He did not attend the community committee meetings. Though he received detailed reports from those who did, his presence was felt primarily through the knowledge that he was watching, that deviations from the agreement would be noted, and that consequences would follow. This knowledge was sufficient. The merchants understood that Johnson had the capacity to make their business operations very difficult, and that he had demonstrated the discipline and organization necessary to sustain pressure over time. The strategy succeeded not because of intimidation alone, but because it had been structured to align multiple interests. The churches benefited from demonstrating responsiveness to their congregations' material needs. The civil rights organizations gained a concrete victory that validated their relevance in everyday economic struggles. The black business owners expanded their market position. Even the merchants, despite their initial resistance, found that the agreement stabilized their relationship with the community in ways that reduced certain forms of friction and conflict. And the residents received tangible financial relief that improved their daily lives in measurable ways. Mrs. Davis, for her part, became a dedicated member of the monitoring committee. She visited stores with a notebook, recording prices and comparing them against the baseline data. She attended every weekly meeting and reported her findings with precision. When Johnson encountered her on the street several months after the agreement took effect, she thanked him for what he had done. He told her that he had done very little, that the victory belonged to the community's willingness to organize and maintain pressure. She smiled at this deflection, but did not contradict him. The Harlem Price Reduction Agreement, as it came to be known informally, established a template that was replicated in subsequent years for other issues. Rent control enforcement, hiring practices at city agencies, access to quality health care facilities. Each campaign followed similar patterns: detailed documentation of inequities, identification of leverage points, coalition building across community institutions, clear ultimatums backed by credible capacity for sustained pressure, negotiated settlements with monitoring provisions. Johnson's involvement in these efforts was rarely publicized. He preferred to work through intermediaries, to let community leaders take public credit, to maintain distance from anything that might attract additional law enforcement scrutiny. But within Harlem's networks of power, formal and informal, legal and otherwise, his role was understood. He had demonstrated that change was possible not through violence or chaos, but through strategic application of organized pressure on institutions that depended on community compliance for their operations. The significance of this approach extended beyond the immediate material benefits. It represented a form of power that was sustainable precisely because it did not rely on individual charisma or on moments of dramatic confrontation. It built infrastructure, committees, monitoring systems, relationships between previously disconnected organizations, protocols for how disputes would be resolved. This infrastructure outlasted Johnson's direct involvement and created patterns that influenced Harlem's political and economic development for decades. When Johnson died in 1968, the obituaries focused primarily on his criminal record and his reputation as a Harlem underworld figure. Some mentioned his community connections, usually in passing or with skepticism about his motives. Very few acknowledged the extent to which he had used his position and influence to create leverage for systematic change in ways that benefited people who had no other sources of power. Mrs. Henrietta Davis attended his funeral. She sat in the back of the church, wearing the same dark blue dress she had worn that morning in September 1963 when she had asked him for $5. The dress had been mended again since then, but she had not needed to choose between her grandson's school supplies and other necessities. The small margin created by lower grocery prices, multiplied across months and years, had been sufficient to prevent certain crises from occurring. She understood, in ways that many others did not, that Johnson's refusal to give her $5 had been more valuable than the money itself. It had been the beginning of a process that changed not her individual circumstance alone, but the structural conditions that had created her need in the first place. The legacy of that September morning persisted in forms both visible and subtle. The monitoring committee that began with price comparisons evolved into a broader community accountability structure that addressed issues ranging from school quality to police conduct. The precedent of merchants negotiating with organized community representatives became normalized, making subsequent campaigns more efficient and less confrontational. The demonstration that power could be exercised through coordination and discipline rather than through violence influenced a generation of organizers who would go on to play roles in civil rights and economic justice movements throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Johnson himself never spoke publicly about the incident or about his broader strategy for community intervention. The few times he was asked about his relationship with Harlem, he deflected with generalities about growing up in the neighborhood and understanding its people. He did not frame his actions in ideological terms or claim moral authority. He simply identified problems, calculated leverage points, assembled necessary resources, and applied pressure until changes occurred. The fact that these changes benefited people who had been systematically excluded from economic opportunity was not, in his understanding, a matter of charity or benevolence. It was a matter of practical organizing, of recognizing that stable communities served everyone's interests better than exploited ones, even if the immediate benefits were unevenly distributed. The price reduction agreement remained in effect, with modifications and updates, until the early 1970s, when broader economic changes, including the expansion of chain supermarkets into Harlem and shifts in residential patterns, altered the competitive landscape. By that time, the principle it had established, that community organization could compel institutional responsiveness, had been embedded in multiple contexts and was no longer dependent on any single agreement or any single figure's involvement. For the elderly residents who lived through those years, the difference between paying 23 cents for bread and 19 cents for bread was not abstract. It was the difference between eating adequately and going hungry. It was the difference between affording medicine and suffering through illness. It was the difference between maintaining dignity and being forced into dependence on charity or debt. The fact that this difference was achieved not through individual benevolence, but through organized collective pressure, represented a form of power that was both more sustainable and more transformative than any single act of generosity could have been. Mrs. Davis lived until 1974. In the years between that September morning and her death, she never again had to choose between her grandson's education and other basic needs. The margin was never large, but it was sufficient. She remained active in community organizing until arthritis made mobility too difficult, and even then she contributed by hosting meetings in her apartment and by making telephone calls to coordinate actions. When she died, her funeral was attended by many of the same people who had worked on the price monitoring committee, who had participated in subsequent organizing campaigns, who had benefited from the changes those campaigns had achieved. No one at her funeral mentioned Bumpy Johnson by name. The connection between his refusal of her request and the changes that followed was not part of the public narrative. But among those who had been involved in the organizing, who understood how power actually functioned in Harlem during those years, the connection was clear. Johnson had recognized that solving Mrs. Davis's immediate problem would have left the underlying system intact. By refusing her and instead targeting the system itself, he had created conditions where her problem and thousands of others like it could be addressed sustainably rather than through the unpredictable kindness of individuals with resources. This understanding of power as something that comes not from individual gestures but from organized transformation of the systems that determine how resources flow was perhaps Johnson's most significant contribution to the community he claimed as his own. It was a quiet legacy, built through conversations in back rooms and church offices, through carefully documented price comparisons and monitored compliance agreements, through the slow accumulation of small victories that compounded into structural change. It left no monuments, generated few headlines, and was largely invisible to those outside the immediate community. But for the people who lived through it, who experienced the difference between exploitation and fair dealing, between powerlessness and collective strength, it represented a fundamental shift in what was possible and what could be demanded. The $5 Mrs. Davis had requested would have bought a few weeks of school supplies. The refusal of those $5 and everything that followed from that refusal changed the economic reality of an entire neighborhood for a generation. This was not a story of individual heroism or dramatic confrontation. It was a story of strategic thinking, patient organizing, and the recognition that real power comes not from controlling people, but from changing the systems that shape their lives.